Hey guys, I think this is like installment 9.
Really? Oh, I was gonna say 7.
It depends on how you count it. I'll have to look. I'll enumerate it when we go back and upload the file to SoundCloud and YouTube and the podcasting app. But anyhow, we're going to be talking about Augustine's On Free Choice of the Will today, the concluding chapters in Book 2 and the first 4 chapters in Book 4. Now, I will say, just for a little backstory, if anybody's interested in this, is that I'm teaching 3 different texts right now that require a lot of background research. So I'm going to have to operate off a lot of my notes rather than sort of immediate recall and put a little bit more on Jordan's plate as we get through this. But enough prelude. I don't know if people even know how much prep we do, but it doesn't matter. Let's just jump right into it. So as I've made the good practice of doing, almost immediately now after we do the podcast, I go over and I try to find out what we did right and what we did wrong. In general, I thought we did a pretty good job last time. That was one of the more difficult topics that we've covered in the Augustine. And I was going to say, by comparison, the prep that we had to do today was relatively easier compared to the last couple of podcasts. There was one dangling question that we had from last podcast, and it was a particularly intriguing one. It was a question of how we were to think about Adam in the garden, if he possessed wisdom, and if you don't want to think about it in a biblical context, if humanity in its sort of incipient state, early stages, before civilization really emerged, whether or not humanity possessed wisdom, and if humanity or Adam did not possess wisdom before the apple bite and the fall from Eden or whatnot, if we were to think about these early stages of humanity as being sort of hyper-intelligent apes, okay? Which I think is a really great question, and I think it raises a lot of interesting rivulets, intellectual rivulets about the nature of how wisdom, reason, will, and all these things fit together. And I thought about doing a lot of research for that, and then I thought that was counterproductive, largely because as we progress through Book 3, we're going to actually have Augustine talk about sin,
right,
and how sin is woven into humanity almost biologically. Maybe that's a wrong way to say it, but he's going to have to
right. So he primes us basically. So I mean, he touches on it just towards the end of like chapters 3 and 4, but yeah, so he totally starts like laying the groundwork.
Yeah. So I was going to say, when we get there, when we start talking about how original sin is transmitted from individuals to individuals and stuff like that, I think we can start having more of a conversation of what man was like in his Edenic state.
Right.
I just thought it was premature to do that before we develop some other essential concepts. Is that okay with you?
Sure.
All right. Is there anything left over from last podcast that you felt that we need to dwell upon?
You know, again, like this is mea culpa, maxima culpa. I need to go back and listen to the podcast because for me, I'm a tabula rasa, come in every week, blank slate, I'm like ready to go.
That's fine. That's fine. So we should jump right into Book 2, chapters 18 through 20. And I'm just I'm looking over here. So Evodius is generally happy with the attempt to prove God, right? Mm-hmm. He's generally happy with that. He's generally happy with the the second question, that trifecta of questions, that all good things come from God. Okay, but there's the third question in that trifecta of questions that he is still uncertain about. And do you recall what that is?
Sure. And the third question is free will one of those like good things that God has made?
All right. And just to reiterate, the fact that we talk about everything being a good thing and sort of coming from God is that we see wisdom and number ordering everything. We talked about this last podcast, how wherever we sort of train our attention, if we know how to discern correctly, we can see how everything can be ultimately traced back to God.
Right. So even the contemplation of, you could say like lesser goods or like material objects, you can ultimately sort of like trace your way back to like truth, like ultimately God.
If you're a beekeeper and you're practicing beekeeping, like you need to see the principles of beekeeping and whatever, you can see the wisdom in it, you can see the mathematics in it, and you can ultimately see that it has this primary source of being.
Right.
The problem is that why is it that Evodius is still hesitant to say that free will is one of those good things that can be attributable to God?
I mean, I think it's just because he's having trouble reconciling the sort of the downward movement of the soul, right? And how does our like free will enable us to do bad things?
Exactly. So if free will were really a good, why can it be used for evil ends? Why can't it be excuse me? Why can't it be like a supreme virtue like justice, right?
Where you can't misuse it.
Right. Like apparently justice is so pure that you can't use it towards evil ends. Right. Why is free will this sort of thing? And the fact that it can be sort of bastardized would take it out of the category of things that would be something that could be traced back to God. Then the question becomes, well, if we can't trace free will back to God, well, where do we trace free will? Right, which sets up possibly, and this is coming from a lot of my background research. I told you guys last week that I've been giving myself some intellectual and historical context by doing the Chadwick Audible book and the great courses, Philip Carey lectures and things like that. Right. A lot of the reasons why Augustine is going to want to preserve free will as a good is so he doesn't get into this sort of Manichaean duality of light versus evil and stuff like that. That ultimately everything has to come from God. Otherwise, so like he's in the process of doing this, although it's not really explicitly said so here. Augustine is on his way to sainthood by combating a lot of Manichaean heresies as a result of sort of establishing the goodwill as something that emerges from God. So, how does he go about mounting this defense that the free will is actually a good? How does he cast it?
So it's interesting because he categorizes it as an intermediate good.
Or Jordan?
So,
why is it an intermediate good?
So I mean, the one thing I kind of like I get on board with Augustine is the fact that he loves to rank everything, and I love ranking things. So he creates sort of this like categorization system of we got like changeable goods, so material goods. We have intermediate goods, which he doesn't really enumerate a whole lot of them, but he kind of lumps in free will as an intermediate good.
All right, well,
and then he has highest goods.
All right, okay. So
which are the virtues?
Okay. So the virtues are the highest goods because they cannot be used towards evil ends, right? We've already talked about how
like justice.
We've already talked about how justice can't be
fortitude.
Right. You can't bastardize these things. So if a supreme good cannot be bastardized, presumably an intermediate good can be bastardized. So like
exactly.
All right. So put this in but yet we don't call them ungood or not good. We still like think they're things to be celebrated. So people may be struggling to understand this concept of an intermediate good. Give us a real life, a more tangible analog of what an intermediate good.
For example, he says, he uses, sight in your eyes as an example, right?
So eyes are an intermediate good. Why are eyes intermediate goods?
Because they're an ultimate good for the body, right? Like we would say that faculty like sight, smelling, hearing, they're all good things. But, for sight, if you don't praise me enough, well, then I might cast you an evil eye.
Right.
I might bore my hatred for you from my eyes into your soul.
Right, but eyes are absolutely essential for us to function as organisms, right?
So we need them, and they're vital, and they're critical for our sort of like completion of our well-being. But they can be used for devious means.
If we didn't have eyes, you and I wouldn't be able to read Augustine. And we wouldn't be able to promulgate the ideas of there being a free will and a God that loves us and punishes us and that we ought to be. If we didn't have eyes, none of that would be possible. Right? But also, like you said, eyes can be used for not so great ends. Eyes can covet. Mm-hmm. Eyes can lie. Eyes can emote anger. There are lots of things that the eyes can do that they weren't necessarily designed for. Right.
And I forget which book it was, but it was like this idea that Augustine said that fire can be used to heal and bread poison. Yeah. So it's this idea that we're given these things like intermediate goods, but we can also, we can use them for, higher purposes or use them for evil ends.
So what does Augustine say? Like, look, the fact that eyes can be used for good or for evil, does that mean that we should strike out our eyes? Does that mean we should blind ourselves?
Exactly. So he's not saying, well,
what does he say? Should we blind ourselves?
Absolutely not.
Why not?
Well, because it just seems like so counterintuitive, right? Just because something there's that potentiality, right, to misuse something. Doesn't mean destroy that good.
Right, exactly.
Entirely. Like, don't gouge your eyes out.
Just because it can
glare at someone.
Yeah, just because it can be bastardized doesn't mean that it ought to be totally annihilated.
Right.
Just like discipline them and focus it on the way that they ought to be used.
Right.
So that would be a lot better than sort of removing it altogether.
Exactly.
So I think
and Augustine even says, like, we can't live without free will. So even though someone might misuse that free will, he's saying that we need that free will in order to be rewarded by God for doing the right thing and to be punished.
And to experience the felicity of being a virtuous person. Right?
Exactly.
Like, ultimately, the free will and coordinating itself, it's not so much that we're doing sort of God's business, although that is going to be a big part of what we talk about in terms of like cosmic order and stuff like that. But like, ultimately, in the most immediate sense of the word, I think purely from the human relation, the existential point of view, is that the goodwill is there for us to live a just and rewarding life, right? So that we can cultivate the virtues. It's not so that we can sort of commit adultery with our eyes.
Right. I mean, it's a means. It's sort of like a tool, kind of like reason, in which we can get to know God in truth and experience like the happiness and joy that comes from that.
All right. So if we've established that the free will is an intermediate good, then I think we can still say that it can be traced back to God, right? So that answers. Right. So that moves it out of the category of sort of ambiguous status, in that all good things can be traced back to God.
Right.
Okay. So I think this raises the interesting question, and I will probably end up meditating on this a little bit. Is that okay? If there are supreme goods, the virtues, there are intermediate goods, the will. What about what the will chooses when it doesn't choose wisdom or virtue, when it chooses inordinate desire? Could we not say that those choices can be redeemed in some way, like that maybe there's some good in them or something like that? And this sets up a problem, because if there is, then sort of evil actions could be in some way traced back to God as well, and then God would be on the hook for sort of evil actions. But so when we sin, or when the will chooses inordinate desire, what is Augustine saying that the will is choosing?
I mean, to me, like, I almost kind of picture it of almost like a train, kind of, and like the free will almost being like a train car, and then attaching itself to different, like engines going in different directions, kind of. So the free will as an intermediate good can kind of either cleave to the virtues, or it can cleave itself to like the changeable goods.
Right.
And, like,
okay.
the lower means.
Well, all right. Well, where do all those trains go?
That's the thing. Yeah.
Do they all sort of glide to their natural place, or what happens when we sort of marry ourselves to inordinate desire?
It's like a complete deviation from like the upright path.
And
I mean, in my mind, it seems that it might take you longer to get back towards that like the correct path, right? The path to wisdom, but it'll like take you more time. Like the longer that you sort of blunder and like you cling to changeable goods.
That, or it could be, and what I'm trying to get here at is like when we choose inordinate desire. So if God orders everything as a result of justice and wisdom, and we keep sinning by choosing inordinate desire, what Augustine says that we're ultimately choosing
is nothing.
Nothing. Okay. So I have to pause there to let that sink in. Mm-hmm. Okay. So when we are disobedient, we're choosing nothing. And this can't be traced back to God, because nothing is going to lack what?
Just any sort of substance.
Any sort of form, right? Because if God is ordering everything through math and wisdom, then nothing is going to be totally formless in regards to wisdom and math. So I don't know how to think. I try to think.
The complete.
So using your analogy,
it's like going completely off the tracks and just not going anywhere.
it would be
just like
a
vanishing
massive disaster if we were to choose inordinate desire or whatever. These different trains that you're talking about would end up into like
just like an oblivion.
Just oblivion, right?
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think, but I guess the question then is, this analogy will break down at some point. When you look at a train wreck and there are all these dead bodies and the train going off the track and things like that, is that still not something? Is there some number or some things that detectable of God that I think that's the analogy probably breaks down a little bit.
It does like at that point, but could we think of sort of sin and its nothingness as like have you ever been in like absolute like darkness?
I mean, of course. I mean,
like literally, like kids. Like one time, I went like for a class trip. Like we went like spelunking in a cave, and like when you picture like when you are in absolute darkness, like you cannot see anything in front of you. Like you feel like a void. There could be someone standing right next to you. You could practically feel like their breath on you, but like you just experience like nothing. That's what I picture.
Well, that's what Augustine's going to say is that sin is going to be sort of the total deprivation of form. It is going to be sort of a nothingness, and
which is cool because it's totally like an abstraction from like what like I tend to think of as like evil or sin, like the angel and the devil perched on the shoulder, like chattering back and forth. It's
hard for me to imagine because especially when even when I was a little boy, I used to still think of nothingness as something, still sort of, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately as I've sort of had to revisit Kant's Critique of Pure Reason for the Schiller podcast and lecture series, is still being sort of forms in and of themselves. Carey in his lectures for the great courses, he sort of described the deprivation of sin as like being like a tear in your shirt. Mm-hmm. So like if God made this shirt, us sinning would be like a rip in it, and that hole, that rip or whatever, is a part in this fleece or whatever fabric. That this fabric that it, like has sort of completely. So it's like a
universal kind of like fabric, kind of like a social fabric, or
I'm going to say like all the analogies are going to break down at some point, but Carey describes it as like a rip in a garment.
Okay.
That something a nothingness has sort of emerged in this otherwise well-conceived, ordered thing that has been created. It's still super strange. It's still super strange.
Wow.
Yeah. So whether we're talking about trains going off the tracks or holes in garments or whatever, sin is going to be sort of this formless mass. Okay. So given this conversation, I had a couple questions, and maybe we've already sort of talked about it. The first thing was, and this probably goes back to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, or maybe Plato as well. I'm trying to remember who sort of originated the band of thieves argument. But I wanted to call into question this idea that the supreme virtues are always unblemished, that things like justice and temperance and fortitude can never be used for evil ends. And like I said, I thought about the band of thieves sort of argument. If individuals within a group, like mob or whatever, there's sort of like a mob justice, like an internal sort of code that allows them to do something grander, to fall apart. I started to think about that movie Point Break. I don't think they rob banks and then they end up like killing each other or something like that.
I haven't seen it, but I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, it's more of a 90s kid movie or something like that. I don't necessarily have the answer to that. But I think it's worth revisiting.
And I think, because part of it, wouldn't that just be the tension between temporal and divine law? Like, I don't know, like, take Robin Hood, for an example.
Yeah.
He steals.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's from people who are pretty terrible, and he gives it to the poor. So, you know what I mean? Like, so in my mind, if we're sticking more to, like, the text, to me, that would just be an example of someone adhering to divine law and favoring that over temporal law.
Well, Robin Hood might be...
That might be like an easier example,
right?
But honor among thieves,
right.
That sentiment, is that it's an ethical code that is more aligned with divine law than temporal.
Right. I think the idea with Robin Hood, is that he's redistributing wealth to the people whose it was originally, right? Because he's living sort of a feudal society where there are individuals who are hoarding up all the income, and whereas everybody else sort of labors in the fields, and he's like, so he's railing against the sort of unjust economy to begin with, whereas. the mob and the bank robbers and things like that are purely out for themselves. There's no larger like social agenda. So I would say that,
yeah, I don't know, but that's the thing. Like, I read this really great book called The Republic of Pirates, and it was about how like pirates were like actually like creating like a just society from like the oppression of like the traditional like sailing companies and stuff like that. And like,
do you really believe that though? Don't you think it would be sort of a rationalization?
I mean, I don't know if you read some of the stuff that happened. So, like, I don't know. There's still, like, that idea that it's still, you know, I would argue that it's kind of, you know, in favor of divine law and sort of saying, you know, the, you know, rules of the game aren't fair, so I'm going to play by a different game.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And the other question that I had, and look, I think we have to sort of bracket that. I think that would be something.
Yeah, we can table it and come back.
Yeah,
for sure.
well,
eventually.
Yeah, yeah. Eventually, like when we get to covering these Greek sources or something like that, you know, because it'll just be so easy for us to do. Because we just wake up, roll out of bed, and this happens.
Always.
Yeah, there's like no,
so effortless.
Yeah. We just know so much. The other thing that I was going to mention here, and I think this sort of piggybacks on the idea, is that is sin always irredeemable? Is it always going to be necessarily going to be this privation? That can God never sort of coordinate sin for his ends in some way? Is it always going to be something that God can't make use of? And I don't know. I think that's I don't know if we can necessarily answer that. But I think it's something worth considering, you know, and if God can make use of sin, those holes in the garments, those blemishes upon the human race or whatever towards his ultimate ends, then I think the concern sort of raises itself again about whether or not God is involved in the endurance of sin and if he can take responsibility for those things. But I'm going to say that Augustine's probably going to say no to that.
Yeah.
But so I just want to raise those questions if anyone wants to, you know, perhaps maybe someone's working on a research paper, or as Noetic starts to come together and we develop master texts and we have more community involvement from people that are using the product, maybe someone will want to take that up as a research endeavor. I think we should move on to book 3, and we're at 22 minutes. I imagine we're going to be talking about this issue. This will easily take us to the end of the podcast and probably through the next podcast or two. But we're going to be talking a lot about divine foreknowledge and predestination, and this is we are freebasing some sort of metaphysical drug right here.
This is it gets real or unreal pretty fast.
Yeah. So let's try to set up this tension here. So in the first 4 chapters of, I think you may have picked up on some stuff in the first 2 chapters of book 3 that I thought were kind of superfluous. I jumped right to the conversation of divine foreknowledge and predestination. Is there anything from those first couple chapters that you want to talk about? I mean, I just didn't see it as that important. Again, but you and I view these things with different lenses.
Right, yeah. So me being a classics nerd, like I really jumped on all over this idea of sort of chance and fortune, because the forces of Fortuna, something that totally just like govern the mind of like the ancient Romans and probably the Greeks, but especially the Romans. Like you see it all the time in Stoic philosophy, and it reminded me of this really great novel called The Golden Ass by Apuleius. And it's basically, and it kind of mirrors, right, Christianity, because this guy, Lucius, he goes to Thessaly, he really wants to understand witchcraft and sort of like probing the secrets of the universe. He is turned into like a donkey, and he's just subject to these horrible things. And here's the interesting part. He's not transformed back into a human until he submits to Isis. So what he is plagued by, he thinks is misfortune in stone blind fortune, but it's really actually Isis, and it's Isis who delivers the salvation and healing. So I thought that was kind of a cool, the fact that Augustine brought this up was like a nod to like the sort of the pagan traditional thought.
Cool. It's definitely really awesome background information that I didn't know
right.
about.
So so it's cool that we get to like meld our perspectives on things.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you. So the tension I wanted to set up with Evodius' next concern is that he is really perplexed as how to reconcile 2 differing statements, right?
Right.
The first one being that that if we believe in God, that we're going to affirm that God foreknows the future, and simultaneously that we do not necessarily sin, meaning that God's foreknowledge does not command us to sin, but that we voluntarily sin. So whenever we enact the will, we are doing that of our own free choice. So essentially, how do we come up with a compatibilistic account where God knows the future and we're also allowed to commit error and commit virtue? So like if we reaffirm that God knows the future, if we go that route, it means that we necessarily sin, it seems like.
Right, because I mean, at that point, we're just saying, well, if God foresees it and he is aware of it ahead of time, well, then we're just bound by his will, and we're just going along for the ride.
We're just puppets. We're just puppet.
Right.
But
which gets us off the hook for a lot of stuff, if not everything.
Everything, yeah. And but if we affirm our radical autonomy, then we would do violence to this divine attribute of knowing the future. We don't want to. I mean, the point of all this is not to diminish God, but to revel in God's greatness.
Right.
So what's the way out?
I mean,
what is Augustine?
I mean, of course, I know the end point, which is basically that just because God foreknows something doesn't mean that it impacts our own will, but there are a lot of gymnastics that he gets from point A to, you know what I mean, to point B, being the conclusion.
Yeah, let me see if I can...
we can kind of both, grapple with it or unpack it a little bit.
Let me see if I can do these mental gymnastics. It's really not that difficult. Not difficult for me now because I've had time to think about it. But Augustine says that these two statements of God foreknowing and us voluntarily willing are not really in conflict. It's really an illusion that they're in conflict. And you're like, okay, why do you think that? And Augustine asks us to think. He says, do you remember last week when we were doing the podcast on Augustine or whatever?
Yeah, sure, why not?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. You
are remembering the past, right? Does your remembering the past affect what happened in the past? Remember,
right? Because it's a faculty.
Right. So so you are remembering the past. Your remembering does not determine the past, unless you want to have this radical thing where there's we only exist at the moment.
Or repaint the past. Yeah.
Right. So God is unlike humans in the sense that God can remember and God can foreknow.
Project.
Right. So when God knows into the future, it's just running memory in a different direction. God is just remembering the future when he knows the future. Now, whether or not you buy this or not, we'll get into it as we sort of discuss it critically. So just as your memory doesn't constrain the past, God's foreknowing doesn't constrain the future. Have I explained that adequately?
Right. Yeah.
So that
it makes sense
God's foreknowing is a faculty, like you said. It's reverse memory.
Because my problem is when Augustine basically says, and I mean, it makes sense, but it didn't really quite make sense in the way that you just explained it when he said that we will by will itself, just like we reason by reason itself. Because he says that in the text, and I thought, well, that's not super helpful. But when you explain it in terms of memory, but projecting it forward, I'm like, oh, okay, now that makes a lot more sense. Right.
So since God does not, if God is just future remembering and it's not determining anything, right? Mm-hmm. Then that allows us to preserve our voluntary willfulness,
which makes God even cooler. The fact that he knows that we're gonna screw up, we're gonna do great things, but he's just it's kind of laissez-faire. You know what I mean? Hands off. He doesn't really meddle in our with our will, which is pretty cool, God.
Well, then this leads to the only real sort of discussion question that I have. And I mean, I didn't go far enough over my lecture series to sort of prepare an answer for it, but we can sort of fumble around with it for a little bit. And, we're coming up on a half hour here. If we end a little earlier, that's okay. So, because I think our last one was close to an hour. I think the question is, how is this going to get God off the hook when things go really, really wrong? So if God Right. So if God knows that the Holocaust is going to happen in the 5th century, what to us is the 5th century AD, why doesn't God intervene? Right.
Right.
Right. That's going to be the
like
major.
what we talked about off mic, about sort of self-defense and everything. You have to have a lot of trust in divine judgment and, cosmic retribution.
Yeah, go develop that idea some more, right? Because ultimately this is going to mean that supposedly, and maybe this goes back to my concern about whether or not sin can be redeemed and how to think about it.
Right. So if we think about it in terms of, I don't know, like a Greek tragedy, right? It's like this idea, I forget what playwright said it, but, you can never outrun the will of Zeus. You can run, but you can't hide. It might happen in your lifetime. It might happen several generations. It's like this idea that, atrocities are always accounted for. And it's it's unsettling that, if someone, if I, walked out of here and, got mugged on the street, that, I would have to just, throw my hands up and just, let my $2 get, taken out of my pocket. But yeah, but then at that point I would have to put trust in God and say, okay, well, whoever did that's a terrible person and they'll have to answer for it at some point in time.
So God will, so God has a plan, right? So God has a sort of cosmic order.
So you have to place a lot of trust in God.
What's interesting to me, and I think about, I think it's a really revelatory sort of sentiment to think about God as the divine foreknowledge as future remembering or reverse memory or whatever.
Awesome.
Which is something I think we're really introducing to a larger audience, and I hope people really meditate on that. But the question is, what are the contents of that memory, right? Is there only one divine plan, right? And this is going to sort of get into a Leibnizian...
Like a larger scheme.
So when God foreknows... Does God foreknow only one future, or does God foreknow infinite futures? Is there a...
See, that's a tricky thing, because I feel like that's... What do we talk about?
You're going to have to get into talk about this being the best possible world.
Like the plurality of truths, right? And we said, oh, well, Evodius, I don't know, a couple books back said, what about all these truths and all this stuff? And it seems like if we're kind of going for, the sort of a unified approach, that... in our minds, we might be only able to conceive them as, numerous, plans and outcomes, but maybe it's just ultimately, coalesces into, one plan.
Yeah, it's kind of how I wonder about it, is, if at the outset of the Big Bang, there's, infinite futures, right? And then as humanity sort of evolves and makes certain choices and things like that, it's the futures sort of winnow down into, the divine narrative. Right. And then, but if that's the case, can you really, does that not limit God's foreknowledge in some way? He knows the set of futures that will be obtained, but he doesn't know the real future that will obtain, because ultimately that is still going to be the result of human agency. Right. Yeah, I'm just saying it's the difference between God knowing all the possibilities and God knowing the real actuality, the thing that is actually going to obtain. And then you get into these crazy conversations is it because God could know, so there could be a situation where there's a hyper plan and then a plan that is up to human agency, right? Where no matter what choices we choose, God's going to impose certain events into the history. My divine plan, regardless of how messed up you humans make this, my ultimate hyper plan will be imposed upon this mess of arbitrariness. So you can commit a Holocaust in 1945, or you can commit that Holocaust in 45, or you can commit it in 5045. But guess what? Jesus is entering into this picture at some point. It doesn't, and it doesn't matter. It this eternal map, Jesus is entering here.
Right. That's the thing. I think we need to try to divorce ourselves from not just our constructs of time, which are totally different now, right? Being, with the Industrial Revolution and time being a linear thing. I think we need to just try to rip ourselves out of that and try to think about cosmic time.
Well, I think,
I know.
yeah, I think I've raised a lot of the. I think anything more I do here. So I mean, look, going forward as we talk about predestination and foreknowledge, I think we should think about the multiplicity of timelines.
Right.
I think we should talk about hypertime. I think we should talk about how much God can know those possibilities and how much they over or underdetermine humanity. I don't know if we have enough prepared today to answer those things.
Right, because right now we're doing a lot of speculating.
We're just sort of introducing the main concepts. I have a feeling that these themes are going to get answered as we get more material. So it may be a little bit counterproductive to continue to speculate on them, unless you want to add something a little bit more. But I think I've covered everything I want to cover.
No, I think
today.
that a lot of the text will sort of unfold these questions that we're positing.
Sure. Okay. Cool.
Cool.
You done?
Yep.
All right.
I'm good.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Join us next week. Bye.
Bye, everyone.